Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's episode, we're going to be doing a bit of a retrospective on the month-long Freedom Convoy protests that took place in Ottawa in January and February. What was it about? What did we learn? How will it impact politics in Canada going forward? And to chat about this, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Malcolm Bird, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Winnipeg. Professor Bird, I want to thank you so much for joining me today.
Great, delighted to be here.
Now, Professor Bird, you actually wrote a short piece, an essay for The Hub about 2 months ago entitled Reflections on a Protest Movement. And you essentially made the case that if the convoy is in fact the most extreme type of political protest that we're going to see in Canada, that we maybe actually aren't doing too badly. So maybe you could sort of explain what you mean by that.
Well, I mean, what I was trying to get at was that no one died. I mean, to be really kind of simplistic and blunt, we had this large, widespread grassroots movement, starting in the West, come across the country, occupy Ottawa and some bridges and other pieces of infrastructure. And there a lot in the media. There was a lot of sort of excitement, and I think a little bit of exaggeration as to how extreme this was. But when you kind of step back and have a look at what transpired. There was very, very little violence. There was no death. Ultimately, this all got resolved peacefully, and yet a significant movement, expressed itself, and it actually entered into the political sphere, which we saw with the happenings in the Conservative Party. And I just wanted to point out to people that this is a beautiful, wonderful thing, because Canada's political systems and our government institutions were able to manage these tensions between different groups. And as I said in the piece, I think it illustrates the discipline and professionalism of actually the protesters themselves, but also of the police forces and who ultimately cleared them away. But yeah, if you want sort of a rough and ready litmus test of is something a really serious problem, the answer, did anybody die? And the answer is no one died. I also wanted to kind of point out anytime I can to people just how good and effective Canadian public institutions are, that our country is wealthy and peaceful and pluralistic. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that state institutions work here. And that's exactly what I saw happening.
So in other words, you're saying the system worked essentially, right? People protested in a way they felt they wanted to, and then the protest was ultimately ended, without any sort of serious violence, or as you said, nobody died. So in other words, you're saying it's in fact a good news story and not a terrible bad news story, as I think a lot of the coverage of the protest has suggested.
That's correct. I mean, I think one of the reasons I'm actually quite empathetic to this trucker movement, and was astonished at how little empathy they received from sort of the elites, use that as a general term, and media. I mean, this pandemic has really imposed a lot of hardships on people. We've had uniform sort of policies, locking things down, not allowing people go to church, a great impositions on people's individual freedoms, including, vaccine mandates and such things like that. And very little resistance to these. And yet that was quite astonishing, the level of intrusion into individual freedoms and rights. No, oftentimes this was required. This was a pandemic. Governments needed to do things. I'm not saying that these weren't, in many cases, were necessary, but it was astonishing the degree to which the state intervened and the unbelievable level of obedience that we saw from Canadian citizens. The problem is that you impose uniform rules, and the effects of them are very diverse, and particularly are difficult on working people, working people as well as young people as well. Young people also suffered, I believe, disproportionately throughout COVID because of these the imposed rules.
Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking today about the Convoy protests that took place in Ottawa earlier this year, and we've got Professor Malcolm Bird at the University of Winnipeg to talk about it. You know, Professor Bird, you were talking a lot about the difference of the impact of the lockdowns as a reason for a lot of the folks protesting it, I think a lot of people who perhaps could work remotely did not appreciate the impact it had on people whose jobs did not allow them to work remotely. But more broadly, you know, we've heard a lot of speculation about what was this protest really about? Was it really just about mandates? Was it about sort of all COVID policies together? There were sort of some extreme demands about replacing the government. What's your take on, was there a single thing that defines this protest, or was it sort of a mishmash of different things?
Well, I mean, obviously it started off as a opposition to the mandates, and I think it did kind of morph into something more than that. And of course, there wasn't really a coherent narrative amongst the protesters. But just, I think, speaking very generally, I think many Canadians were tired and frustrated at having their lives upended through, like I said, uniform policies that have a very diverse effect depending on where you live and what you do and your age particularly. I think there was a real urban-rural split illustrated in this protest, in that, I think ruralites have a very different view about lockdowns and this kind of thing. And obviously, as we mentioned earlier, I think there's an occupational division here. But I also think that there's a cultural division here. Increasingly, much has been written about the sort of the cosmopolitans, the urbanites versus sort of the rural, place-specific people. And I think we see a lot of that. And when you evident here in that much of the reporting and the sort of public narrative reflected sort of an urban, educated elite perspective, and as did much of the sort of support behind COVID restrictions, etc. So there's actually sort of a cultural, I believe, sort of a cultural dynamic here playing out between urban cosmopolitans and rural, place-based working people.
I want to talk a bit more about that actually on the media front. Obviously, the media who are in Ottawa had been living through the protests themselves. So, for things like, horn honking for days in a row, the media themselves were subjected to that. And, there was concern that perhaps it's very difficult to be objective in covering a protest when you yourself are sort of, being affected by it dramatically day in, day out. What did you think of the media protest, sort of the media coverage of the protest? Was it reasonable? Did you see a bias, and do you think it sort of accurately reflected what was going on in Ottawa?
That was actually the part that bothered me the most. No, I did not think it was objective. I thought it was deeply, deeply biased. I thought the media emphasized all of the fringe and marginal elements of this protest movement, which of course all protest movements are going to attract fringe and marginal and radical elements. But I don't think that actually reflected sort of the core group and the core message that these folks were trying to pass along. And when you compare this coverage to other protest movements, whether it's environmental or Indigenous or identity politics based, the media I found to be much more empathetic and sympathetic towards this, towards those causes, than to these. I mean, the best illustration, of course, was the illegally obtained donor lists that much of the mainstream media, published and drew upon. I mean, that never occurred to any other protest movement. They didn't have their donor lists. Similarly, the impact that foreign donors had. There was much discussion about that in this case. And of course, we know in environmental movements, a lot of the money is coming from outside of Canada, particularly the United States. And again, that kind of point is sort of omitted. And so, yeah, that was actually the most troubling part. Was just how I felt, how poorly the media, the mainstream media, reported on this event, with the exception of the National Post, which had a little more balanced perspective, in my view.
Yeah, very interesting points by Professor Bird. We're going to continue this conversation about the convoy protests in a few minutes after this short break. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about the convoy protests from this past January and February with Professor Malcolm Bird at the University of Winnipeg. Professor Bird, I just wanted to talk maybe more broadly about, maybe we could just call it political polarization. This has obviously been a sort of growing concern across the Western world over the last 5 to 10 years. And I wanted to get your thoughts on whether you see this trend happening in Canada as well. Some people argue it's actually a myth. Some people say it is happening just like everywhere else. What's your take?
Well, I think it is happening here in Canada. And if I could sort of look at one cause, it would be the, I don't want to say collapse of the left, but perhaps the altering of sort of the political and the ideological left, to be not very interested in the conditions of working people. So working people throughout the West, particularly in the United States and in Britain, have really suffered largely because of things like globalization. They've lost their manufacturing jobs. And what traditionally their concerns were reflected in the Democratic Party and obviously the NDP party here. And much of the left is now not concerned with the material conditions facing working people. They're concerned with climate change. They're concerned with identity politics. And so that is part of the reason why the hardships that working people have faced has not entered into the political sphere. And that's a lot of the reason why people like Donald Trump and obviously Brexit occurred and were elected, because they were speaking to the challenges that working people are facing. Here in Canada, we're seeing a similar dynamic occur, where the Conservative Party is realizing that they need to come up with viable policies to help working people, continue to live a high standard of living, because of course real wages have either declined or stagnated over the last 40 to 50 years.
We've seen a lot in recent years. Obviously, you mentioned the US and the UK, sort of working class, formerly Democrat voters in the US switching to vote Republican for Donald Trump. And then more recently in the United Kingdom, where we saw some parts of Northern England, which had never voted Conservative in 100 years, voting Conservative for the first time under Boris Johnson. Do you see anything like that taking place here in Canada? Do you see anyone, I know there's a Conservative leadership race underway right now. Are the themes and discussions that you're seeing take place in this race, do they suggest that there's a sort of similar thing happening here in Canada as well?
Yeah, I think there is. Now, I mean, the nice thing about Canada is that we're extremely wealthy, and we have a pretty, for the time being, we have a pretty strong welfare state that redistributes goods and services amongst the people. So that makes us a little different than the United States. But I most certainly think that we are, particularly with the case of inflation, which is going to eat away people's standard of living very, very quickly. This is going to further polarize the difference, the standing of working people versus others. Of course, I also think that there's a cultural component here, where people who work with their hands, live in rural and remote communities, feel increasingly alienated from urban cosmopolitan folks, and so I think that there's a good chance that this is going to occur occur here. And certainly when we look at the Conservative leadership race, Mr. Poilievre, Pierre Poilievre, I think that's how you say it, is really addressing very basic concerns of Canadians: inflation, housing prices, jobs. How is Canada gonna make wealth? What's the role of our oil and gas sector in our economy? I mean, those are really, really important and core questions that need to be addressed. And he, as well as some others, are addressing them. And I think that will bode well for them in the future.
Okay, we've only got about 30 seconds, and it's a bit of a big question, so feel free to pick it up after the break as well. You talked about the disconnect between different perspectives, sort of blue collar and white collar. There's always been those types of jobs. And so what explains the reason why now that, these two groups don't seem to be able to understand where the other is coming from? Sorry, we've only got about 10 seconds.
Well, I don't think there's a lot of intermixing. To put it really simply, I think you can talk in your echo chamber online and not interact with other people.
Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about the Convoy Protests with Professor Malcolm Bird from the University of Winnipeg. Just before the break, we were talking about the reason why there's a bigger disconnect. And Professor Bird, I get you to expand a bit more. You're saying that there's just no mixing between sort of working class and professional class people anymore. Is that the reason that people simply have no reference point for the alternative perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one variable. That it's important to have, like I said, institutions that promote class combination, combining, and the military and churches fulfilled that role traditionally. But I think there's other reasons as well, which is that we seem to be kind of allergic to diverse ideas and to debate and to discussion. Certainly, if we look towards our post-secondary institutions, they are very, very, they're not open to debate and discussion. I mean, even 10, 15 years ago when I was a graduate student, we would have debates and discussions, either formal ones or, within the classroom, we would, get heated and discuss ideas, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of that has really disappeared, certainly disappeared at my university. And a large reason for that is that we've sort of come to the conclusion that words themselves can be hurtful. So if you hear an idea or a thought that you don't like or it hurts your feelings, then that's actually a lot similar to somebody assaulting you physically. And once you kind of go into that sphere, I don't really think there's any sort of a place to have open and frank discussions if you're worried that someone's going to be actually hurt by your words. I don't know of one Canadian university president, and perhaps there is one and I haven't heard of it, to actually come out and say, that universities need to be places where, you debate and you discuss, and that sometimes means hearing things that you like or that may offend you, et cetera, et cetera. And so the chill effect that the absence of those types of statements have had is that our universities are essentially mono thinking places, with the exception of a few voices. And a similar thing in the newspaper and the media. There seems to be great congruency in how things are reported. I mean, normally reporters would go and get one side of the story and then they get the other side of the story and they try to be objective and sort of present a balanced view. Well, I increasingly don't see that in the media. Oftentimes when I watch or read in the paper, the perspective of the view has already been chosen for me. So, I grew up, debating and discussing with my friends a lot, and I found it all to be very fun and very, very valuable in terms of challenging my own ideas and challenging other people's ideas. And that seems to be lost. Debating discussions is critical to have robust ideas, and that's also why a lot of the ideas coming out of the universities not very good.
Those are very good points. I wanted to put to you too the role of technology and social media. If we live in a world now where you can sort of choose the facts you want to see and sort of curate the things that you want to see, you're less likely to be exposed to other ideas and viewpoints in the first place, and so you're simply not used to them, and when you do encounter them, they may have a more jarring effect than if there's something you've sort of seen all the time. So do you think that the role of social media in sort of fragmenting or sort of self-stratifying what you see and hear is playing into this as well?
Absolutely, and my understanding is that the algorithms are specifically designed to do that. I suppose what the problem is there's always been sort of biased media sources. I guess what really I find troubling is that institutions like schools and universities and the teachers and professors in them, just to use an example, should be encouraging people to go out and seek other sources of information. You should, and that's really not occurring. I encourage my students to read conservative stuff, left-wing stuff, secular stuff, religious, what have you, and then you start to see how information is sort of skewed, as it were.
Yeah, I agree. I apologize, we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for joining us. We'll have to have you back. This is a fantastic discussion on, I think, a very important issue, the convoy protests and the fallout for the country. I want to thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again on the next episode of Our Canada, Our Future.